So this is a very informal conversation. Welcome everyone. My name is Dinerstein. I'm one of the faculty directors of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Melissa Lagila, and I'm Melissa Lagila here, and she's the assistant director for the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. And we've been both of us, well, mostly her, organize some things for you. Professor Dinerstein is here with us today for what would be the first of a cycle of roundtable sessions on disability rights. Professor Dinerstein runs the clinic on disability rights here at WCL, and he's also the supervisor of our wonderful two disability fellows from Open Society. And I don't know if you guys want to introduce yourselves
Hi,
to the group.
my name is Laura. I'm from Colombia. Like Macarena said, I'm a fellow for the Open Society Foundation for the Disability Rights Program. I'm here to give my own international United States.
Hi, my name is Luisa Guzman. I am also from Colombia, and I am doing the fellow in the International Legal Studies program as well.
Good. All right. So, thank you, Paul.
Sure. And since we are a small group, and I know a number of you in different ways, maybe others can just introduce themselves. Give us a long, no more than 10 minutes for each person. Kathy?
On the spot. Kathy Sullivan Kohler. I took Professor Dinerstein's wonderful class last year and suggested that there be a disability in the law too, but nobody's listening to me, so I'm just very glad to see this event. Glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Justin Berger. I'm a 1L.
We're excited to be here.
And no memory left of anything because you've already been over now for 6 weeks. So why would anything else?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hi, I'm Michael Scarantino. I'm in Professor Dinerstein's Disability Rights Law Clinic, and I'm also the co-director of the Disability Law Society here at WCL.
Hi, my name is Naomi Hassan. I'm also a student attorney in the Disability Rights Law Clinic.
Hi, I'm Alex Ricky, and I'm also a student attorney in the Disability Rights Law Clinic.
Hi, my name is Miriam, and I'm an SJD student.
Well, thank you all for coming. And as Macarena said, I think notwithstanding I'm standing here at a lectern, I'd like this to be pretty informal. I'll talk a little bit about my own connection, particularly to disability rights in the human rights context. And then some of the major things that are going on thematically, and then really want to open it up and get a sense from you all as to questions that you might have. It's a very exciting time to be talking about human rights and disability rights for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is the continued evolution of life under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD. And because of that, I think it's a great time to be looking into it, studying it. Those of you from other countries have an opportunity, I think, to see how your own countries are dealing with some of the issues that come up. And let me just say right out, there is no country where it is perfect for people with disabilities. There's variations, gradations. Some of them are north-south, some of them are resource issues. But the fact is that every country, to some degree, struggles with how best to integrate people with disabilities. And so some of this depends on your perspective. You can be a glasses half full person or glasses half empty. But so certainly over my time in this field, there's been a lot of improvements and developments. But some days where we're falling short seems more important than where we've achieved things. So anyway, a little bit by way of background, and particularly I'm going to focus on my work in the international arena because it is not work that I came to WCL particularly with a background in. In fact, far from it. I came here out of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and was a domestic civil rights lawyer with a particular focus on the rights of people with disabilities, both in institutions for people with psychosocial disabilities or mental illness and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. So The work that I did, and this is in the late 70s, early 80s, where we saw many institutions that were just horrific, people who shouldn't have been in those institutions, people who were abused and neglected and sometimes died within those institutions, horribly understaffed, all kinds of significant problems. And I mention that because while I think U.S. care has improved, both because there are many fewer people in institutions and those institutions that are left are somewhat better, nothing that I've seen in other countries is not something I haven't seen here. So again, I think when you're from the U.S. and you're doing some of this work, if you have any tendency to think, well, we figured this out, why can't you? Our history really belies that. It's just not the case. In any event, I started here in 1983 teaching in our clinical program. I still teach, but not at that time teaching in a disability clinic because we didn't have one. So I taught in our criminal clinic. But I guess the first things I started to do that were really disability in an international way were in the early 90s. An organization which is now called Disability Rights International, but at the time was called Mental Disability Rights International. The director of which, Eric Rosenthal, I think will be actually doing a later lecture in this series. Was newly formed. A newly formed organization. There was a 3-person board of directors, including Professor Schwartz, me, and another colleague outside of WCR. And Mental Disability Rights International went and did on-site visits and basically evaluations of conditions for people with mental disabilities in other countries. So they got a lot of funding to do work in Eastern and Central Europe, and then expanded to do work in Latin America, and over time have done exposés and full reports in Mexico, Uruguay, Hungary, Ukraine, Russia, a wide range of countries. And one of the things that, first things I did with them was to go on a visit to Hungary, where we not only saw their psychiatric hospital, but also met with judges and others who were involved in the guardianship system in Hungary. And I remember very clearly a judge saying, well, yes, this is a legal determination about whether someone should have a guardian, but to be honest, I don't really know how to make that judgment. I just turn to the doctors and say, what do you think? And they tell me, and then that's what I do. It was kind of horrifying. Not, again, something I hadn't seen in the States, but something to reflect really the sense of whether or not something as, and I'll talk later about this, but something as all-encompassing as guardianship, taking over decision-making from somebody, could be imposed in such a almost cavalier type of way. The other thing I remember about that visit was we toured a psychiatric hospital, not a terrible one as those go. We went up to one unit, and as we're walking onto the unit, we see like a group of 6 patients huddled around a television. And this kind of television therapy is very common, again, in the States as well as in other countries. I was really sort of, curious what they were watching. And what they were watching was a U.S. show dubbed into Hungarian. The show was the original Dallas. And those of you of a certain age will remember J.R.
Yeah.
and Larry Hagman as J.R. Ewing. And they're watching this and glued to the television. I think this was their sense of what life in America must be like. What a horrible thought. And of course, no one with any clue that this at that time had been off the air probably like 15 years. So it was just sort of an odd way that life in hospitals. I can tell you that when I did some work down in Arkansas, I remember going on to one unit, and in order to help people be oriented to what's going on in the world, they have these things like, today is September 30th, the weather is cloudy, and something else, so that you have some idea of to be able to orient yourself. Except I was there in September, and they said today is June 20th. It is sunny when it wasn't. It's like, so if you're going to go to the trouble of actually helping orient people, you might want to be accurate when you're doing that, because this poor group, to the extent they were looking at all, they were 6 months old. So anyway, I digress. But the work that DRI was, or MDRI was doing, was really so interesting, because they went into these foreign countries, and their goal was not simply to look at situations that were problematic and that violated human rights and report on them, although that was certainly a big part of what they did, but also to work with groups in the countries themselves to help build self-advocacy movements, NGOs that would sustain the work beyond it. Because one of the problems in doing human rights work generally, and again, there are folks here who have that background beyond disability rights, like obviously Macarena in particular, is if you come in and write a great report and write the expose and a lot of noise, and a couple months later it's on a shelf somewhere and no one's really following it. If to implement rights, and this is a very big part of work in the disability rights area, you need people on the ground who understand it, who will take it and work with it, and hold people accountable. And that's always, I think, been one of the DRI's really important qualities, as opposed to, say, some of the traditional human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, which maybe were more report-oriented and a little bit less build-up capacity. So anyway, I enjoyed being on their board. I was on their board for many years. DRI was here, and then eventually moved out a couple of years after we actually moved into this new building. I then got involved with the World Health Organization, WHO, which had a project, actually still does, which was to help countries modernize their mental health legislation. So WHO had a whole project to try to get countries to have statutory criteria, this was mostly for people with psychosocial disabilities, to make sure that they weren't just using hospitals as warehouses. One of the things about institutionalization is that it is a form of social control. Right? It is a way to keep people out of sight, out of mind. We've heard stories that in some countries, when some visiting dignitaries are there, the country doesn't want to be embarrassed, so they round up people essentially and put them in a hospital. It's as if last week when the Pope was here, we just kind of went around and said, maybe this was done. Actually, I haven't heard that. But we don't want homeless people here while the Pope is here, or something like that. We don't want mentally ill people here while somebody is here. And so people would be round up, and there'd be no statutory real protection against just doing that. So WHO had developed this complicated series of guidelines, and they wanted, or they were working with countries that were interested in modernizing their statutes so that, in fact, there could be limitations, because being put in a hospital against your will is, as the Supreme Court said some years ago, a massive curtailment of liberty, even if you're getting good treatment, and query whether that is happening. The idea that somebody could, on their own, just take you, pluck you off the street, put you in an institution when you've committed no crime, and say you're going to be here until we think you are better, is a very horrific kind of circumstance. So the idea that WHO had was, let's at least go in and using some, at that point, soft law, international law, let's go in and try to get countries to that are interested in doing so to clean up their act. And at that time, there was something called the mental illness guidelines, which were from the early 90s, which did not have the effect of law, but were kind of a best practices view of what kinds of protections ought to be in a commitment statute. And that included things like, you may not commit someone to a psychiatric hospital unless they are dangerous to themselves or others, and there's no less restrictive place that you could receive treatment in, which was a kind of a standard conception at the time who could be committed. Well, WHO had a very grand plan about how to roll this out, and one of their plans was to get a group of international experts and train them in the WHO approach, and then have them be available as expert consultants to countries that were interested. So I went to such a training, I think it was fall of 2003, and then for some reason that it's, I think, just random, was asked to go to 2 African countries. I had, to that point, not been to Africa, but I think actually the issue was they literally at that point had not been able to identify any lawyer in Africa who was sufficiently up on human rights issues for people with disabilities that they could kind of contact. So I worked with a group of non-lawyers, but who were from the region, first in Ghana and then in Malawi. Big differences, by the way, in how those countries understood and how willing they were to make changes in their statute. Ghana was seemingly much more ready to do things, although in the event it took almost 10 years, actually more than 10 years. Malawi, lovely place, lovely people, very poor country. At that time, I think the 3rd worst country in terms of the ravages of AIDS and HIV. But not really with the infrastructure to really, in a sense, implement a set of statutory changes. I do, in the Malawi visit, I was there with a psychiatrist from Zimbabwe, and we did have the, again, I'll use the word horrific experience of watching someone be given electroshock treatment without any anesthesia. So you're connected to lots of electrodes, they run current through you, you kind of have what looks like a seizure, I think actually is a seizure for a very short period of time, and then you're done with some loss of short-term memory, maybe longer-term memory. In some cases, for some kinds of particular depression, it's actually thought to be the treatment of choice, but not without some kind of anesthesia, not something that's going to protect you. And they said, well, we don't have any anesthesiologists here in the country. We have nobody who can step in. And I was really happy I was with my colleague from Zimbabwe, who was able to say, well, all you really got to do is train nurses, and they at least would be better than the untrained people that you're using. So we were able to kind of say it doesn't require a lot of resources to do something more than that. And so that was, and other countries were part of this project. These are just the two that I was involved in. It was kind of interesting to see them. But it was very much focused on law, and on particular law, and essentially maybe I would say misconception. It was maybe believing that if we don't do anything else but we change the laws to make them better, maybe that'll make change happen. And I think there's a real question as to whether that leads to any kind of sustainable change, because maybe the lawyers think it works better, the psychiatrist thinks it works better, but if people in the system don't understand it and don't use it, it may not be as effective. Around this time as well, and this is now in 2004, I was at a conference and wound up being a signatory to something called the Montreal Declaration on Intellectual Disabilities. And this wound up being also sponsored by WHO and also in PAHO. And the idea was to come up with almost like a declaration of rights for people with intellectual disabilities. The UN system had done some declarations earlier. In 1971, there was a declaration on the rights of what were then called mentally retarded persons. There have been decades of Decade of the Disabled Person, the World Program on Disability. All these things, again, were interesting. As time went on, they got better in terms of the content, let's say, but nothing was enforceable in whatever way human rights instruments are ever enforceable. But whatever there was now did not have then. But the Declaration was an important thing, and one of the things that was important about the Declaration is it was the beginning emphasis, at least internationally, on rethinking guardianship as one of the ways in which society exercises control over people. And as some of you know, because including Clint, guardianship is essentially a system for making decisions on behalf of people who are thought not to have the ability to do that. It can be over the person, it can be over the finances of a person. It often is proposed as something that's a humane alternative, but in fact it can have very deleterious consequences because it takes so much power away from a person. It would be as if we said to all of you, any decision you make from here on out, you don't get to make, someone else gets to make it for you. They can talk to you maybe, but they get to tell you, do you have the roast beef sandwich or the turkey sandwich? That's their choice. Do you go to class or you skip? That's their choice. Who do you live with? All those, it can be very pervasive and very problematic. And going back to Hungary for a second, the way Hungary used guardianship was when the authorities wanted to put somebody in what they call a social care home, which we would call a nursing home. They would get a court to appoint a guardian. The guardian would sign the papers admitting the person into the social care home, and then never see them again. And so now the person had authority to be there. It wasn't his or her choice. And there was no way to really get them out because the only person who had the authority was long gone. It was quite a terrible system, and not unknown within particularly parts of Central and Eastern Europe. So anyway, the Montreal Declaration was maybe the first really clear indication that maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe we have to move to alternatives to guardianship and protection. And then we fast forward ahead, although this is beginning to happen at the same time, to the big thing that's happened in this area, and that's the debate over and ultimately adoption of the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I think, historically quick time frame from the beginning of its being introduced by Mexico in early 2001 to it being adopted by the General Assembly in 2006. A very inclusive process of writing the provisions of the convention, of debating it. So you had the ad hoc committee that was designated to write the convention, but there were working groups and of civil society, both domestic and international, that worked very, very closely with those delegations. So it's really, I think, the first participatory human rights treaty that we have. And as a consequence, I think, had a lot of buy-in from people, not just the UN types or the international diplomat types, but also people who were much closer to the position of the individuals being being covered by this treaty, and in particular by civil society. So Inclusion International, a number of different groups, Handicap International, Disability Rights International was involved in it, individuals who kind of represented, World Network on Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. A number of different groups were very actively involved in that drafting process, and it really shaped how the convention came out. And it reflected something which is one of the mantras of the disability rights movement, and that is nothing about us without us. The idea is if you're going to write laws or conventions or treaties that affect people like us, we need to be at that table. We have a version of that here in DC, no taxation without representation. Same kind of thing. Why should we be subjected to one set of things and not have the opportunity to sit at that table? So that nothing about us without us is a very key thing. It also reflects something that's very important with regard to the CRPD's overall approach, and that is it reflects a particular model of disability, a social model of disability, as opposed to, let's say, a medical model of disability. Right? So historically, the way many people thought about disability, if we go way back, there's even differences, but let's just say modern historical times, people thought of disability as a medical issue, something that can be fixed. So if you have a condition that is amenable to treatment, medication, and other kind of interventions, so we can fix it, we should do that. If we can't fix it, we should try to minimize the effects of disability, rehabilitate. But the problem is with the person, right? It's your hearing impairment, it's your vision impairment, it's that you have an intellectual disability. That's what we have to work on. Social model of disability says rather that disability is really something that's the interaction between a person and his or her environment. Something which may not be limiting in one set of circumstances, may be very limiting in another. If you use a wheelchair and you are in a city that does not have curb cuts on your curbs, you can get to the end of that curb and you're stuck. You can't get down onto the street without someone lifting you, and that's not so easy to do and not very convenient. And so you are disabled, if you will, in that circumstance, at being able to get around. On the other hand, if there were no curbs at all, or if there are curb cuts so you can kind of slide up and down, you are not limited. It doesn't mean you can now walk unaided, but it means that you are mobile. And that's a very common example that people use, but if you think about it, it's true for many things. Sometimes the environment is a physical construct. Sometimes it's attitudinal. Things that we think about people limit what those people can do. So what it means is that when we're thinking about reform and thinking about making changes, we can't just look at the person's situation. We have to look at how that person is situated within a particular societal context. That doesn't mean that the person may not have some responsibility to, for example, point out accommodations that he or she might need, work with an employer, work with a provider of public accommodations to make sure that things are right. But it also means that that other entity has some responsibility as well. Right? If the person is in a wheelchair and goes to a theater with steps, and they're not going to be able to put the ramp in, but they can say, look, I'd like to go to your theater if there were a ramp or other way for me to get into the theater. And so that's become a very important part of how to think about disability. A little bit about the CRPD, and again, a number of you I know are knowledgeable about it. It came into effect, as I like to say, on my birthday, May 3rd, 2008. I'm a little older than the CRPD, but we'll let that pass. And that's the point at which the 20th country had ratified the treaty. Right now, I just looked this morning, there are 160 countries that have signed the CRPD, including the U.S., and 158, or all but 2, have ratified, not including the U.S. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So what are there now, 193 countries or something in the world? I always get confused between how many ABA law schools and how many countries. It's something like that. So it's very few countries have yet to ratify, but again, we are one of those. There's also something in the convention called the optional protocol, which allows individuals to bring individual complaints against state actors. That's not something the U.S. is ever going to sign or ratify, so no one's waiting for that. But as to that, there have been 92 countries that have signed off on that, and 87 have ratified. So that's a pretty good percentage, actually, because it does subject the country to somewhat greater sanctions by being open to those individual cases. So this is a big deal, and it's a pervasive thing around the country, around the world. And the U.S. has, as many of you know, a very conflictual relationship with human rights treaties at best. We're doing a little bit better with the CRPD than the Convention on Rights of the Child, but only because the convention is older. And as some of you may know, depending on when one has talked about the Convention on Rights of the Child, we were either one of only 2 countries that hadn't ratified, briefly 3 when South Sudan was created, and now I think down to 1. I think Somalia and South Sudan have now ratified, which means that literally we're the only country in the world. And the reasons for that are, I think, somewhat bizarre. Something having to do with kind of a U.S. exceptionalism, some belief that we know best and countries shouldn't be telling us what to do. We already have it all figured out. Again, the assumptions about this, I think, are quite troubling, but they are there. When the convention was adopted, signed in 2006 and adopted in 2008, it was the end of the Bush administration. Bush administration did not support signing the treaty and did not, even though members of the administration, including from the State Department and the Justice Department, were quite active in the negotiations toward producing the CRPD. They actually, at the level of the technical level, were very helpful. This is not just a U.S. view, but there was no hope that we could sign at that point. In fact, we had a conference here that the center sponsored. This would have been probably in about 2007 or 8. In which we had some officials from state and justice as well as others talking about, well, would the U.S. sign and ratify the treaty? And I thought it was interesting that there were 2 inconsistent arguments made, but they were made quite often about why we couldn't sign and ratify. One, we don't ever sign treaties and ratify them unless we know we are fully compliant. And since we don't know that yet, we couldn't sign it. Well, if that were the standard, no country would be able to sign the CRPD because there is no country meets the qualification. But then the other argument, which is almost the opposite, is we're already doing all these things. We don't need to sign it. Well, we can't have it both ways. But again, that was the view at that point. Barack Obama ran as one of his elements of his campaign that he would sign the CRPD, and he did. And he signed it in July of 2009. And signing it means you also make some commitment to seek ratification. And they were, in fact, focused on trying to get that treaty ratified. Again, as I'm sure many of you know, the way treaties work here, it goes to the Senate for ratification. You need 67 votes to be ratified. And that has to happen before it comes into effect. And even when it is in the United States comes to effect, it's not self-executing. So you would still have to pass laws afterwards, but it obviously would be an important thing to happen. And a little side note, at one point, when the Justice Department and the State Department were putting together the package, which is actually quite extensive, that the government, the executive, would send to Congress urging ratification, we had a role in that, which was we were asked to do a 50-state survey of state guardianship laws to see whether, given what those guardianship laws said, the U.S. could sign the convention, given that Article 12 of the convention, depending on how you interpret it, either strongly limits or completely eliminates guardianship. And we did the 50-state study in the clinic. We divided it up among all the clinic teams. We made the claim that the U.S. could sign it. Maybe more hope than truth, but that's what we said. And that actually went into the analysis that was submitted to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when ratification came up the first time, which was a few years ago. So that was a nice thing to be able to see that, from the clinic side of it, getting without attribution, but nevertheless, it was there. Anyway, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee approved it. It goes to the Senate floor. This is December of, I think, 2011 at this point, or 2012. And they even, Senator Robert Dole, who was a conservative Republican and now would be probably a radical Republican, who is developed a physical disability from World War II, had been a senator, had since retired, came back to the Senate, was sitting in a wheelchair. All his colleagues went up to him and shook his hand or tapped him on the shoulder, and nevertheless voted against ratification. So the ratification came up. I was actually in Colombia when it was that was happening. I must say it was very embarrassing to be from the U.S. when the convention was coming up for ratification and to see it fail. And it looked like it was going to pass. I mean, I think that the people deciding to bring it up thought that they had enough votes, so otherwise they would bring it up. And it turned out they were a couple of votes short. So they got all the Democrats at that time, And they needed, I think, about 12 Republicans, and they got about 8, so they could not do it. And some people said, well, the arguments made against it were, frankly, somewhat specious. I mean, one was, for some reason, the homeschoolers, and turns out to be a very powerful lobby, got all up in arms, and I think it's also consistent with their objection to the Convention on Rights of the Child, to thinking that this convention was a bad idea because it might force parents it might take away the right of parents to determine their child's education. How they got there, I don't know. But somehow, a very well-organized lobby, Senator Rick Santorum was very active in it. They managed to submit enough email traffic and otherwise to senators who didn't see much percentage in going against that. They weren't necessarily opposed, but it's like, why take a stand? It's not the profile of courage. And so it failed. It failed by a few votes. It then came up again, because you can keep coming up. And it came up again in the next Senate, which was now maybe less prone to approve it. There's a slightly more conservative Senate. But at that point, again, and actually as it was doing this, more and more declarations, reservations, and understandings were being added to the convention. And so it was actually people getting nervous that maybe this thing isn't going to even be worth it, because there were some things that are very standard in U.S. treaties, that we have a federalist system, we can't necessarily say that we can control all what's going on in state laws. Okay, there's an abortion provision. There's various things in there which were troubling. In my view, they didn't, in fact, undercut the treaty, but some were getting a little nervous. The argument one was here from people against the treaty at that point was more that second argument I alluded to earlier. We've got the ADA. Why do we need the CRPD, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act? And the fact is, Americans with Disabilities Act does some wonderful things, but there's many things that the CRPD covers that the ADA does not. There's some problems with the ADA that the CRPD manages to avoid. It's not really an answer to say that the ADA covers the waterfront on this, and so the CRPD is somehow unnecessary. Nevertheless, in the lame duck session before the 2000, so this would have been late 2014, the Democrats did bring it up and again didn't have enough votes. So right now it's dead. It can be revived. I don't think it's going to be revived, well, there's no chance it could be revived before the next election, because nobody has enough of an interest in that to do that. So if there is going to be something that's going to happen, it would not be until 2017, and that probably is going to depend on A, who gets elected president, and B, what the makeup of the Senate looks like. One person who has been very active, involved in the effort to ratify, who's someone I've known for a long time, told me that he was talking to one senator, a Republican, who was rather moderate on these issues, and said, well, why do you have so much trouble with it? And he said, well, I don't have a problem with it, but I have no reason to stick my neck out on this, and I'm hearing from people who don't like it. So, basically give me a reason to go against my constituents, and the answer is, not sufficient. So it's very hard to figure out. I mean, this is I don't know if maybe you remember this. After the first time ratification failed, this shows you sort of the level at which it kind of reached public understanding. The Daily Show, the Colbert Report, I mean, they went after this. They're like, how could anybody be against these treaties? This is truly for something that everybody should be behind, which was rather extraordinary for a human rights treaty to get that kind of attention. But again, outrage, yes, but effective action in response to that, no. So we're left in that situation where a lot of people would now still scratch their head and say, how come the U.S. hasn't done this? I mean, they got veterans groups involved, and they're a very powerful lobby. They were very for this, but they couldn't muster enough support, and that's been very disappointing. Okay, but the rest of the world has the CRPD, so I want to end this part before opening it up. Just talk a little bit about what I think some of the key issues are in the sort of disability rights realm, and particularly through the CRPD. Although it is important to know, the CRPD is not the only treaty that governs things. I know that Lisa and I were talking yesterday. There's the Marrakesh Treaty on rights of people who are blind or have low vision in terms of access to print and other materials. That's a very important treaty, which is on its way to ratification, but not quite yet. There's certainly the Universal Declaration. I mean, there's a lot of other things that are there that have affect different aspects of life, but the CRPD is really the big thing. the CRPD has a number of articles. I won't go into them all. I have focused a lot on an article that I think many people have seen as one of the most critical, and that's Article 12. And Article 12 is called Equal Recognition Before the Law, but it's commonly known as the Legal Capacity Law. And what Article 12 says, it's not very long, but essentially says that everybody has legal capacity. No exceptions, no question. No matter what, you've got it. You can't lose it. You get it just by being born. But some people, in a sense, to exercise their capacity, may need support. And that's really almost all it says. May need support. And then it talks about avoiding conflicts of interest and the like. From that little may need support, the many interpreting that article, including, very importantly, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the entity that reviews states who are reporting on it, have said what that means is that no one should be subjected to guardianship or any other kind of intervention that takes away their right to capacity. Some people, if they need help, could make use of supported decision-making or other kinds of alternatives to help them, but it's still they who are making the decision and not someone else. Now, some people would believe that you can have some forms of limited guardianship and still comply with Article 12. So countries that have been at the forefront of coming up with alternatives to guardianship, countries like Australia, Canada, Sweden, Germany, and some others, nevertheless still tend to have some kind of limited guardianship and have reported to the committee and said, we get it about general complete guardianship, but we think some of these limited guardianship things should still survive. The committee, however, has been unanimous and consistent. Every country it has reviewed that has guardianship, and every country does, they have said in their concluding observations, you are in violation of Article 12 because you still have guardianship. You must get rid of it and develop supported decision-making. We could differ about whether that's the only interpretation. There is a general comment that gives a lot of support to it. There's a thematic report by the High Commissioner which gives some support to it. If you knew some of the players, you know that this looks a little bit less arm's length than it seems to be. But still, those are things that countries, even countries that are doing a lot to reform guardianship, are going to have to deal with because they've got a definitive statement on part of the committee. And so that's, but notwithstanding that, it has pushed countries like Bulgaria, Croatia, some others, to really do some quite significant reforms of their guardianship laws to get at least closer to compliance with Article 12. So I've written about and talked about Article 12. We're actually looking to possibly have a conference here in the spring, which I don't get to talk to you guys about necessarily, with actually be sponsored with Open Society Foundations, on how countries are doing and implementing Article 12 throughout the world. And OSF might bring in some of its grantees to talk about that. So we're looking forward, if that happens, to hosting that here in our great new building to be determined. So Article 12 is an important one. Article 14, which talks about the limits on coercive use of confinement for people with disabilities. Again, some take the interpretation that Article 14 means there are no circumstances on which you could confine someone against his or her will on the basis of disability. If you have a reason to confine them for other reasons, like they commit a crime, you can do that. If you have other reasons to use preventive detention, you can do that, but you can't use disability as a ground. And again, that's kind of controversial. Article 19, which talks about the right to live in the community, which is a very big, important issue, again, as a way to push back against institutionalization, which continues to be a big problem throughout the world. And many other provisions that talk about rights of women and children, rights in the education system, work, rehabilitation. Also importantly, provisions about implementation. That every country that ratifies the convention has to have a focal point within its executive branch, essentially, whose job it is to make sure that the convention gets implemented. And then they have to have a semi or somewhat independent entity monitoring their compliance with that. I'm actually working on a chapter right now in conjunction with some work that Derek Cogburn, who's here at the School of International Service, is doing with the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia and their compliance with the CRPD, and in particular with the provisions on monitoring and implementation of the CRPD. And again, it's a bit of a mixed bag, as you might expect. So I did want to tell you that as late as Monday, there was a new signatory to the convention. That's Belarus, and the Bahamas ratified. So I don't know about you, but I think the Bahama ratification requires an on-site visit. But no one has to tell me that. The committee, I mentioned the Committee on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it meets twice a year for multiple weeks each time. It just finished up its 14th session just a couple of weeks ago. Its 15th session will be in April. Again, I was not an expert. I still would not call myself an expert in the UN system, but there's a kind of certain dance that goes on. So the country files a report. The committee says, here's the issues we think we want you to address. The country comes back and addresses those issues. They then have an in-person hearing, including entities from civil society that can say, yeah, Spain said they're doing all these wonderful things. Let me talk to them. They're not, and here's why. There's questions that go back and forth, and then ultimately the committee issues what are called concluding observations. It says, here's what we think you're doing well. I'd say they're rather parsimonious about praise, and then they go into a lot of the ways in which the countries are not complying. But it's a process, right? So it's like, again, I don't know what the fears of those who are opposed to ratification, what they are. I don't know if they imagine the UN as a standing army that can come into any country and start blowing whistles and saying, you're violating Article 12. It doesn't work that way, right? It's all a part of a conversation that moves a little bit over time and over, maybe in time that seems very slow, but does result in some changes that go on. So that's pretty much the lay of the land about where things are. And I think now I want to just open it up and answer any questions or hear from you all, some observations you've got, questions about anything about international disability, what we're doing in disability here at the law school, which we talk about including the Disability Law Society. So the floor is yours. Yeah, Ken.
What is the Disability Law Society here doing? Working on any particular projects? Or?
Well,
So currently, this actually was an event today that we have a listserv that we send, so people sign up for our listserv and we send out emails for people to come to events. So this was one event, for instance, that we sent out to our listserv. It wasn't a specific Disability Law Society event, but we're actually in the process right now of planning events for the year, and we have several ideas. We just sort of need to get the groundwork sort of, we were thinking about doing like a founders event at the new school of some type. On what topic we wish to explore. But typically, if you're part of this listener, we email and we advertise what events we're doing. So, but we're also open to people suggesting, what they might be interested in or what they want to hear about. We're always open to sort of taking suggestions and putting on events for, whatever particular interests are. So, yeah.
Over the years, and I guess it's now been in existence for 4 years.
Yeah, I think it was in the, I want to say that, I've been the co-director, this is my second year, so I think, 3.5 years.
Yeah, so it's interesting because this is, I'd say, in my time here, the third group that has had some focus on disability of a student organization. So years ago, back in probably the late 80s, there was a sort of a Students with Disabilities organization. So it was focused on students who identify as having disabilities, with a very active student, Sam Lee, who's just one of these force of nature type students that we had. And he was great, and he was an activist. He's actually somebody who worked with the vending of students to include in our materials for admission that we welcomed applications from people with disabilities. It was like one line, but it was actually, I think, quite helpful to say, please, we don't begrudge you coming far from it. We want you to come. But when he graduated, it kind of died. Also, I think, and was really interesting, and I don't think it would be that different today, to be honest, but it might be a little bit. Having it be a group about people with disabilities meant that some people just weren't that comfortable in disclosing that. If they had, it didn't necessarily say that you couldn't be in the group if you didn't have a disability, but I think people interpreted it that way, and if you didn't have an obvious disability, you might feel like you were unintentionally outing yourself in some way, and so it kind of died. There was then another effort to kind of start one again from a student group about 10 years later. They lasted about a year, same kinds of issues, I think. In fact, one time, and this was with the first group, with the vending of students, he and I wanted to do a session on career planning for students with disabilities, and basically just talk about some options about if you don't have an obvious disability, do you disclose it to your employer? What are the pros and the cons? We actually brought in somebody who was in private practice who had a learning disability and did not disclose and talked about that. We had to do it on a Saturday, and we had to do it without saying what it was. So someone's like, come to at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning and you'll find out what's there. And I didn't want to be, I certainly was going to be respectful of people who had those concerns, but I also thought this is almost replicating the very thing we're trying to fight against, right? We seemingly are reinforcing this sense that this identity is something that is problematic. But again, not as one without that identity, it wasn't my place, and particularly as a faculty member, it wasn't my place to tell students what to do. 4 years ago, with two particularly active students, decided to create something that wasn't now going to be students with disabilities, although we certainly could include them, but was about disability law. So that's why the current focus is on anyone interested in disability law, and even implicitly does not imply that you, not suggest that you have to have had a disability or have one. And have done different things. I mean, I think 2 years ago they were doing sign language. One of the co-founders was fluent in sign language, so she did, they did sign language lessons like once a week or something like that.
Yeah, I think that the focus the last few years at least, I think it's just because it's been such a hot topic, it's been institutionalization. So last year, for instance, we co-sponsored an event at the Journal for Gender and Social Policy. They put on that at Sidney Austin. So we co-sponsored that event. It was about institutionalization. There was a panel there and a lunch about institutionalization of people with disabilities. So I think, and then when the previous co-directors before me, their also focus was on prisons and institutionalization. So that's just sort of the focus that, because it's been such a hot topic, and that's why we're sort of now sort of looking for other interesting areas. I mean, I'm particularly interested in employment and disability, so we'll sort of see, what this. I mean, we want to talk about Uber and accommodations.
Right.
So,
Uber and Lyft, and I know Kathy's very interested in voting issues. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's out there, and again, very much up to the society about to focus on. The other thing that we've informally talked with the administration about is, we're moving into this wonderful new building, and of course we know it's going to meet architectural standards, but there's meeting legal standards, and then there's really being a place that is truly accommodating to people with disabilities. And so we basically have said, give us an opportunity, give the DLS an opportunity to, almost do a walkthrough at some point just to see how things work. I mean, if you have to use a ramp to get into some place, is it a convenient ramp? Is it inconvenient? And a lot of things that have gone into the building, we hope, will take account of things like, for example, in a classroom, not just have 2 seats available for wheelchair users way in the back, and if you happen to be someone who also wants to sit close to see the board when you're stuck because you can't do both, well, there'll be a way to get to the front. So those kind of things.
The nothing about us without us concept.
Right.
Have people go in and make sure.
Yeah, because in my experience, I mean, as knowledgeable as you are, if it doesn't affect your daily life, you're not going to be as able to say, wow, this doesn't work. And I remember doing an ADA inspection at another school, and they were very proud of showing me, they had one of their professors was a wheelchair user, they were very proud of showing me the way they had the lectern laid out, and you put the computer here, and its notes here, and it would work. And I talked to the professor and said, how's that working? He said, it doesn't work at all, I don't use it, it's terrible. I said, okay, so why, and again, it was not to beat up on them, but that's kind of the deal, right? The designers, the builders, unless they're really good at reaching out and working with people with disabilities, they're likely to make, those mistakes. So anyway, we'll say, see this, check the space as time goes on. Disability law society. Other questions?
I actually do have a question. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot, but you mentioned the convention or the treaty and the differences between that and the ADA. Now the ADA is not enough. I'm wondering, and you mentioned there are changes in the treaty, or there are things about employment. What sort of are the differences, the big major differences between sort of the way Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act targets employment disability?
Right.
So what are the big differences?
Well, I would say that, well, first of all, one thing that's really interesting, the CRPD does not define disability.
Right.
Okay. It defines some characteristics that any country's definition must meet, so it's not a completely open-ended, but it is pretty open-ended. So one thing I would say is, not now, but before the 2008 amendments to the ADA, I would say, well, the CRPD covers people with disabilities that the ADA had been interpreted not to under Title I. And again, for those, some of you do know this, but for those who don't, until 2008, the Supreme Court had decided that if you had a disability, but you were taking medication, wearing glasses, doing something to mitigate the effects of the disability, you had to, a court had to review you with all those conditions in place, whether or not, to determine whether you had a disability. Which meant that if you were doing anything, like a diabetic who was on insulin, a person with epilepsy who was taking medication to control it, whatever that might be, the very fact that you were doing things to control it meant that you couldn't even bring the case, let alone prove discrimination. In 2008, the Congress amended the law to throw that back out. So now there's more of a connection. I would say that the definition of the ADA under Title I for employment discrimination is more or less consonant with what the ADA, with what the CRPD said. A very facile answer to your question is, because the CRPD is not simply focused, as many of the U.S. statutes are, on political and civil rights, but also on sort of what social, cultural, economic, there are areas that are covered in the CRPD that you wouldn't be covering in the ADA, or covering in a kind of mixed way. So again, guardianship is a perfect example of that. The ADA, you can make an argument that the ADA under Olmstead actually might cover guardianship, but it's not explicit, and as yet it's basically just something in the law literature. It's not really, there have been that many court cases on it. Whereas you say the CRPD absolutely covers something like that. You know, health issues, which again tend to be more state by state in the U.S. There's rights of, it's interesting that there's right of, there's sort of publicity rights in the CRPD, which some think are inconsistent with our First Amendment, some of those kind of things in terms of like what things are said about people with disabilities. But it's really more that it's the areas of coverage are different. The CRPD, like the ADA, has a provision for reasonable accommodation, so it includes that as a form of discrimination. And then, of course, enforcement is a whole different deal. So in Title I, you've got enforcement through EEOC and private litigation. The CRPD just says, we don't tell you how to enforce, we just tell you you have to have a system of enforcement, and you have to monitor how that enforcement is done. But I know some folks, I mean, Armin Cantor in Syracuse, for example, makes the argument that ADA, great civil rights statute, CRPD, human rights statute. And the difference really has to do, I think, with the areas of coverage as much as anything else. Okay, questions?
I have a question. So where do you see the main issue being in, so I have two questions. One is, what do you see that being the main issue in 10 years or 20 years? Do you think that guardianship will be the sort of like the main issue that the movement of people who are advocating for the rights of people with disabilities will be focusing on, or is there any other topic that you foresee being sort of like at the forefront?
Well, that's a great question. I think guardianship will continue to be an issue because, I mean, I should say, when more people were institutionalized, guardianship was not as big an issue because people were not out in the world making decisions. In fact, some places, the superintendent, this was true in D.C., the superintendent was thought to be guardian of everybody in the institution. I mean, not through court order, but just kind of treated that way. It's sort of like a plantation mentality where the master runs life. As people started being let out and or not avoiding institutionalization altogether, it became more important for there to be somebody who was in a position of making decisions. So that is taken a real, it's a very evolutionary process. So I don't think that's going to go away. I think we'll see more and more alternatives to guardianship. We're seeing some in D.C. We've been talking about that in the clinic already, in the educational system here. There's actually a guidance that encourages use of supportive decision-making instead of guardianship. There's a proposed law in D.C. that would just been submitted by the mayor that would also extend that. So there are pockets of these kind of things that are going on, but I think that's going to continue to be an issue. I think employment is a huge issue. I think that one of the critiques of the ADA has been, maybe it's not fair about the ADA, but the idea is ADA passed in 1990, if we compare the level of employment of people with disabilities in 1990 with today, not only do we not see a great increase, there's actually in some ways been a decrease. Now, there's multiple factors. I don't think you can blame the ADA, but what certainly is the case is just passing the ADA did not result in a substantial increase in the employment of people with disabilities. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities when compared to comparably educated people without disabilities is hugely higher. And so there are many, many people, and of course the recession didn't help that at all. So that's going to be an issue. And then within that, and this is particularly with respect to people who have intellectual disabilities and to some extent psychosocial disabilities, getting them out of segregated quasi-employment situations like workshops and getting them into the competitive economy, either with support or without. So the Justice Department has just signed off on an agreement that's proposed to the court in Oregon in that case, which would significantly, severely limit the use of these so-called sheltered workshops, which in another era were seen as a reform, as a way to be able to have people working and paid very much below the minimum wage, but at least not sitting around on the wards doing nothing. Okay, well, 40 years ago, that's where we were. Now the idea is, no. I mean, working in areas where you're doing work and getting paid 50 cents an hour when you could be trained up to be working competitive employment. So that's very much an issue. Justice Department has an agreement with Rhode Island to get rid of that. Again, this probably will be an accepted argument in Oregon. So that's an issue. I think that healthcare kinds of questions will continue to be issues: access to healthcare, access to right to health, the highest obtainable level of health. I think education, huge issue. Again, it's a combination of different statutes in the U.S., but I think we're getting better, but we still don't have as inclusive an educational system, again, either here or really anywhere. So I don't know if there's any area that I would say, one hopes over time there'll be less focus on institutionalization because there will be fewer people institutionalized. But you could make the argument that what we've really done is what was called in an earlier area trans-institutionalized. So we're closing down or reducing greatly the size of psychiatric hospitals, but those people haven't gone away. We've just put them in the jails, as we talked about in class today. So there's a little bit of that. Nursing homes have functioned in that way as well. I view institutions as a form of social control, as I was saying earlier, and I think that perceived need for social control doesn't go away. I think you mentioned Uber. I think transportation became a huge issue, and for countries that are not financially as well off as we are, it's more and more of a challenge. It's one thing to build going forward with disability in mind through concepts of universal design. If you're building a city now, you would make sure the curbs were more accessible. You would do various things. You would make sure the buses were. But most countries, and including many that are quite old, this question of retrofitting and rehabbing, and that's expensive and it can be difficult to do. And there's often just, again, even when you've got all the infrastructure in place, things break down. Again, we just heard that today. So there's a bus, someone needs a bus who uses a wheelchair, it has to have a lift. Oh, the bus with the lift, that's broken. So you got the other bus and they can't pick you up. Or metro, the escalator isn't working, or the elevator isn't working and you can't take the escalator, so you got to get off 3 stops ahead so you can get, and these are things that, some people call it the microaggressions of things, where you're in a position where day to day you have to sort of deal with some of those things. So I think all those things are good. I don't think there's any issue that we can say, done. I don't think it's a question. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the committee reviewing whether individual signatory countries have been consistent with their statutes under the CRPD.
CRPD,
right?
Not COPD, which is something you watch on TV.
Yes. So would you be able to speak to a little bit how the CRPD deals with policy and pattern and practice issues versus individual violations against, like things like private remedies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it means to paint in a broader brush with that kind of pattern. So, they will look at and comment on, you've got a statute that does X, but we heard indications that things don't happen. So to give one example, in a number of countries, not in the U.S., but a number of countries around the world, they actually have quotas for employing people with disabilities in maybe 3% or whatever that population is. And if you just look at that, you say, wow, that's pretty good. It's ensuring that you have people with disabilities in the workforce. But almost every place that has it doesn't comply. And part of the reason is you can usually pay some amount of money to get out from under those, and so it becomes almost like a tax more than anything else. So you might see something which says, good news, Japan, you've got that, but we heard information that, in fact, your level of employment with people with disabilities is still well below what you want it to be. So you tend to see something like that. Or, you reformed your guardianship law. You used to have only general or plenary guardianship. Now you have limited guardianship, but you did not, in fact, displace your guardianship system altogether with particular, with moving towards a supportive approach. So they wouldn't say, in my experience, well, in the John Jones case, you did this, you did that. It's more like looking at what the laws say and then what people might have said in general about how those are implemented. So, again, those of you who do more human rights international work, I don't think this is different so much from, what the Committee Against Torture might say, or CEDAW, or CERN, but I think it's really a part of a conversation that goes on. Like, there's something to be said for, having to go before a body and defend yourself, and getting a report that's critical, and, again, depending on the country and the regime, they're either going to take it seriously, they might marginalize it, but at least it's there. And again, it may be, its main value is it's there for people who are advocates in that country to say, hey, look, UN said, we're not doing this or that, let's do something about it. And for some countries, they don't want to be embarrassed by it. Other questions? I just wanted to, we're kind of at the end, but I did want to mention, because we alluded to this, but just as a way to, a couple of things that go on here about disability. One is, again, we have a disability rights clinic, which is now in our 11th year. And there are a number of disability clinics around the country, but a lot of the ones around the country purely do benefits work. So it's Social Security, disability insurance, supplemental security income. Nothing wrong with that, but when I started this clinic, I really wanted us to be able to focus less on benefits, where we'd have to go in and show, look how disabled our clients are in order to benefit, or however needed it is, which it is. But rather more issues where we could be arguing for things like alternatives to guardianship, or we could be arguing more about autonomy and dignity and the like. And it's never a perfect mix with what you want to do with your cases and what the cases do, which but that's been our approach there. And as to that, we're one of the really very few clinics that does that work, where students are performing the primary lawyering as they are in a clinic. So we have the clinic. As Kathy mentioned, I teach a disability law seminar every spring. It's sort of a heavily ADA, but not solely ADA. We actually do talk about CRPD as well. And that's a writing seminar with a small paper that you have to hear in conjunction with that course. We also have a global disability rights course, which is going to be offered this spring by two adjuncts, Janet Lord and Eric Rosenthal, so both excellent and well-regarded lawyers and teachers. And that's in particular, it's something that's part of what we created to have something for our disability rights fellows. There is, in some years, and unfortunately it wasn't this year, a mental health law course in the fall. There's sometimes a special education, usually special enforcement. There's plenty of places, and some of you know this from your own experiences, in the city to do internships with organizations or government agencies that do disability work. It's great. Many disability rights folks who are around, so it's either on the Hill in terms of certain committees, NGOs like the Bazelon Center, University of Legal Services, Civil Rights Division, a number of different places like that. So all those are, I guess, things that we are doing that are kind of curricular, and there's co-curricular in the Disability Law Society. And then, of course, with the Disability Rights Fellows, this is a wonderful project that's sponsored by Open Society. There are 6 universities in the world that are recipients of those fellows, and we're one, and we're the only one of 2 in the U.S., the other being Syracuse. We were there before them. And the host, or the sending countries, change a little bit from year to year, but Colombia, which is this year's, where both of our students are from, has been one. We've had, I think, somebody from Colombia at least the last 2 years in a row. Argentina, which is sometimes in, sometimes not. We've had folks from Nepal, Tanzania, Kenya, and so it tends to be developing countries, or at least some, not from Western Europe, for example. But I think it's been the concept of it is that students come here for a year, get an LLM in international legal studies in a human rights concentration, but that within the human rights concentration, a disability rights focus, and then the plan to go back and make noise and create controversy in their home countries or wherever they wish to go back to really use what they've learned here as a way to inform their advocacy. So it's the 4th year, I think, of the program at this point. It's a really wonderful program to have. And the group, the other schools are all places that, again, have made commitments to have classes and other kinds of programs that will work, that will have a kind of disability rights focus to it. So they've been very excited to do that. And I've also, meant to mention this before, but I've done other work with Open Society, which is consulting with them on their funding of disability rights clinics, both in Latin America and in Africa. So in Colombia with PAIS, which is a wonderful clinic at the University de los Andes. We've worked with folks at Católica University in Lima, in Mar del Plata in Argentina, and then in Midlands in Zimbabwe, and a series of schools. I did some consulting with them as well about disability rights clinics and classes in about 8 Southern African countries. And had the pleasure of going to Zimbabwe and Mozambique and talking to them about how they're teaching disability rights. And what's really interesting about all that, apart from my racking up frequent flyer miles, is that there are definitely, as we all know, differences between countries, differences, cultural, ethnic, religious differences. But a lot of the things that people with disabilities face really cut across all of those differences. So a lot of the challenges that people are facing has a lot of commonality to it. So consequently, when you're teaching about disability rights, or when you're talking about the issues, you can really talk about it at a level of generality that is going to be probably pretty applicable. I mean, there are some countries, for example, and again in Africa, that never really went the way of institutionalization. So maybe in that country, that's not such a big deal. But you might find a country in Africa where there's still a very strong culture of traditional medicine, so that if somebody is acting in a way that makes it seem like they're, we would say, hallucinating, it's seen as possession of some kind, and sometimes that's dealt with in a way that we would consider quite inhumane. In Ghana, heard of people, chained to trees because the healers weren't really sure how to deal with them, but they couldn't really figure out what to do. So, it's not to pick on them. There's other, unfortunately, you do this work, you do hear about things like so and so. We heard they had a child with disability, and then one day they didn't, and we're really not sure what happened. Implication being probably they went to the forest somewhere or to the river. Other places, again, we heard this in Ghana, where families would come to the door of an institution, say, "Here's my son or my daughter. We need to take them." Give a false address. Never heard from again. The person was, they never said their time. So it's if you do this work, you have to have a certain thick skin in terms of what you see and hear, but it's also reinforces how important work is. I think that's all we have.
We're in time also.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.